changing weather last week to this week, so that might have something to do with it.
You know how it goes. Spring arrives late in Colorado. It came. So.
I'm happy that I'm here for this week.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right. It is Monday, April 4. It is now 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. I wrote Standard Time on here. This is panel 1305, and it is an aria entitled Why I Risk My Life to Bring You the News, featuring freelance conflict journalist Anna Day. You may read Anna's biography in the program, but I will add that as a native of Boise, Idaho, Anna is happy to be back in the beautiful American West, and she has brought with her two of her crew, Tony and
Connor.
And Connor, who were spent a little time in detention with her in Bahrain about a month and a half ago.
Thanks, guys.
All right. So I do need to talk a little bit about questions for this. If you are all experienced veterans of the Conference on World Affairs but haven't attended a session in this room or in the center ballroom this year, there is a bit of a difference about how questions are submitted. And I'm going to read a script here so that you hopefully will understand how to submit questions. Audience questions for this discussion will be submitted via text. This trial format is motivated by a desire to allow our online audience to participate in the Q&A period and by a desire to improve the overall quality of the Q&A period at the Conference on World Affairs. To participate in text question submission, you first need to join this session. In fact, if you think you might ask a question in this session, I'd encourage you to take out your phone now. So when I told you to turn it off earlier, turn it back on. Okay. To join this session, send a text message to the 5-digit number 37607. Again, 37607. This is illustrated on the posters to each side of the stage. In the body of the message, you will type the keyword UMC 235. Again, that's UMC 235. You will get a confirmation message that you are now part of this session. Just reply to that message with your question from the panel. They will appear on this screen magically, and I will read as many as I can. Please be succinct in your questions, just as you would if we had a microphone. My understanding is that earlier, some of the more long-winded questions, some of the wordier questions were cut off. So please don't risk having your question not understood or not read because it was too long. All right. If you are a student, please note that in your question because the tradition of honoring students and hearing from students first will continue. So put in your text message, I am a student, Zach Lyons, whatever, okay? Nice hat. If you are a student, note this in your question. If you would like your first name and your location read aloud, please include this information in your text as well. If you do not have a cell phone, please get the attention of a producer here in the room. Raise your hands, producers. Wave them about like you just, well, they care. The producers can provide you with a 3x5 index card and a pencil or pen for you to write your question if you do not have a cell phone. Finally, text the word leave, L-E-A-V-E, when you leave the room to close out your session. I hope not to repeat these questions or these instructions again, because we're going to conduct a nice question and answer with Anna. We're going to go about 25 to 30 minutes on that. Then we'll do another 15 to 20 minutes of your questions. We have to vacate the room at 11:50 because there is another session at noon. So hopefully we'll be as on task as we can possibly be. My name is Jeff Brown. I am the director of something called CU News Corps. It is housed in the journalism department in the new College of Media, Communication, and Information here at CU Boulder. All right. We are ready to go. I'm going to give Anna a few minutes to just kind of introduce herself, talk a little bit about why she's here, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Well, thank you all for coming to this panel. I'm excited to see such a turnout and an interest in my story, and I hope that translates to an interest in journalism and why it's important to not just journalists, but to the health of our democracy. I see journalism as a career in service, as a career in the public interest, and in informing our democracy in decisions of war and peace in my capacity, but also decisions about our community and accountability of elected officials. So this is why I not only want to talk about journalism, but also the threats that our industry faces that impact our ability to do our job. I started international, I work primarily in international reporting in the Middle East, and many people are interested in how I decided to move to the Middle East. My political awareness, and based on my age, came in the wake of 9/11. And it was during that time that I was a middle school student interested in my first research paper topic, which was the Vietnam War. And my teacher made me narrow in on something that was particularly interesting to me, and that was the media coverage. The Vietnam War was the first war in history to be broadcast into American living rooms. It's called, in our space, the Living Room War. And it was those images, whether it was napalm attacks on civilians or the Pentagon Papers' incredible investigative reporting, that are important parts of journalism history, but also important in our collective understanding of what war looks like and the realities and what's really at stake in the ground. So I was learning about that as we went to Afghanistan and Iraq. And while I started learning about the history of journalists and journalism in terms of the Vietnam War, I was also learning about censorship and the steps that the government has taken since the Vietnam War in terms of lessons learned in controlling the message and making sure citizens don't see the impacts of American foreign policy decisions abroad. That's some of the examples of that is embedded press corps, only allowing journalists access to our military instead of civilians in the field. There's also enormous censorship right now in terms of surveillance, which is an enormous problem and threat to journalists in my field. But the most important thing that I learned in my first research paper was a quote that said, now because of the embedded press corps and the censorship on media, the American public will only see fireworks in the sky instead of the horrors of the reality below. And I read that right when we were going into Iraq, and some of the first images we saw were just these fireworks in the sky and these night shots of what an invasion looks like. So that was incredibly powerful as a young person to understand the power and responsibility of media. Later, I learned much more about the media's role in the wake of 9/11 in terms of being silenced, in the fear-mongering that happened right after 9/11, but also in terms of not asking the right questions or scrutinizing our public officials in the lead up to the war in Iraq. So my political awareness and coming of age coincided with this intersection of journalism and foreign policy and the failures of journalism that led to devastating implications, not only in terms of America's stance in the world, but civilian loss overseas. I moved to the Middle East as a result of this, I was interested in the region that we have been most involved in militarily in my adult life. I wanted to learn Arabic. I wanted to learn about Islamic culture. I fell in love with modern Middle East history and got some good advice early on in college to learn about the history and politics of the region and get to the region as soon as possible. As a student, I was an anti-Iraq war activist, far more so than I was, an aspiring journalist. So when I went to the region, I first studied Arabic in Jordan. Jordan is we're starting to call it the West Berlin of the Middle East because it's remarkable that it's still standing, given the refugee populations that it's absorbed. It historically has absorbed the Palestinian refugee population, and when I arrived, it was absorbing the Iraqi refugee population. So at age 19, I met people who lost their homes, who'd seen war crimes committed by American soldiers, and were more aware of what American foreign policy looks like than I was. So that was a very formative experience, and I went on to study in other parts of the Middle East where I met other activists who inspired me tremendously. They were risking their lives in countries where freedom of expression comes with an enormous toll. So I was inspired by my peers, connected with them with similar politics. When I graduated from my university, I returned to the Middle East, and it was about that time that I started getting phone calls from these young activists in Egypt saying that I needed to come down to Egypt for their revolution. We saw Tunisia fall, which was the country that overthrew its dictator first, and I thought, well, I'm already in the Middle East. If I don't spend $200 on this plane ticket and get down to Cairo, I'll never forgive myself. Of course, I could have never anticipated that it would be the revolution that it became, but I was there for the first days of the people breaking into Tahrir Square in the beginning of what would be a historic revolution, not only inspiring and shaking the region, but inspiring movements across the globe. My career since then has been very similar to and very much reflects the trend in our industry. I was a freelancer, and overnight I went from being a student to a war correspondent. Major news networks contacted me and wanted the story from the ground. Also, since the industry has scaled back so much on these foreign bureaus, a lot of times they're understaffed in the region, and they had their normal press people within the government because they were dealing with dictatorships for years, and all of a sudden they didn't know who to talk to. Who are these Twitter revolutionaries? Who are these young people? And these were people I'd known for years at that point. So I was very able early on to work as an assistant producer for major news networks, and that's how my career started. Like many other young journalists, I traveled to other Arab Spring countries where we were able to report, I think, differently than many of our veteran colleagues because we were telling the stories of our peers. We understood their language technology and really felt a camaraderie and solidarity of what was at stake for them. So we told, some of the most amazing stories, but at the same time, we were offered rates that, as a beginning journalist, of course you accept that to be published at a major news outlet, but we now realize that these rates were framed as opportunities, but of course were exploitation. It was the same exploitation that allowed the industry to fire veteran reporters across the country, veteran photographers, and we essentially kept their foreign bureaus afloat by freelancing at unprofessional rates. As a journalist starting off, again, you would maybe accept these hoping that those rates would change as you continued. We've seen that many of those rates have not. Yet, even though we were kind of the scabs in the industry, it was the same veteran journalists who were now returning to the field freelance who became our mentors and are the greatest champions of journalist safety and training. It was those journalists who housed us in their hotel rooms in Libya because they were still getting expensed hotel rooms and meals and drivers. These are the same reporters in Syria who trained me in how adrenaline affects your brain, which is, it can be very shocking at first. Other journalists who, lent me antibiotics when I got sick. You prepare for a million things in a war zone, but actually your health can be one of the most debilitating and dangerous parts of risk management. These are the same journalists that I met veteran journalists, a whole hotel lobby full, who, convinced me it was the right move early on when a news agency essentially asked me to jeopardize my sources. And these veteran journalists not only, advised me to trust my gut and, maintain my integrity, but also offered up their Rolodexes to provide other opportunities. So we created this amazing community of support among journalists that we then started an organization called the Frontline Freelance Register. It's the only representative body founded by conflict frontline journalists for conflict frontline journalists. We founded this in 2012 after our colleagues started disappearing in Syria. We'd already lost titans in our industry in previous wars in Libya, which we'll probably talk about, and also in Syria. And then it was these freelancers who were our friends, who were abducted. And we were asking the news industry to take responsibility for this and treat our colleagues as they would have treated their staffers in previous years. And while we are now delighted to be in negotiations with the industry on these safety issues, it wasn't until we all watched the broadcast of our colleagues' execution on YouTube that the industry came to the table. So again, we're delighted to be involved in constructive conversations about better safety standards, but we've certainly absorbed trauma in a way that our editors and producers in New York certainly can't comprehend and weren't able to support for a couple of years. So that's kind of, I guess, the climate that we're working in. Press freedom, particularly, press freedom around the globe, but in the region that I work in, it's not just abductions by ISIS. It's also imprisonment. We just came from Egypt before a month ago, where colleagues are rotting in jail for the crime of journalism. So we see this throughout the region, also throughout the world, but the stakes have really never been higher. And we just see the number of deaths of journalists escalating each year. So that's why journalist safety is an issue that we're lobbying for quite a bit in our space, but also something we do want to share with the public, because we do believe that journalism helps us make the incredibly important decisions of war and peace, and our ability to report safely with the support of the industry is what we need to be able to do that.
So can you just talk a little bit about So I'm sure that most people here have heard about your experience in Bahrain, but also just generally address the specific title of this panel or this aria, in that, times where you really have felt that your life was at risk and what that involved. And then to follow up, and this might be part of it, is why is it best in traveling to some Middle Eastern countries not to get the official journalist work visa and to go as a tourist?
Yes. Well, to start with the first question, the organization that we're, and the safety process that we're a part of with the industry is a process that will ask the industry to implement best practices and improvements in pay and their training, but also requires that freelancers take extra steps to ensure that we're protecting ourselves. So it's a mutual process, but one of the things that is always going to be an issue for journalists is, while the best practice is always getting press credentials when you can, the issue is most of us work in contexts where press freedom is not respected. And in those contexts, if you're jeopardizing your source's safety or your own, it's best to work undercover. We feel very strongly that in many of the places that deny press freedom are some of the most important places to be reporting. So that's to address the issue of press credentials. I bring this up because this was what we were initially charged with in our case in Bahrain. Bahrain is a tiny little island in the Middle East that most people haven't heard of, but in terms of the Arab Spring, it actually had the largest participation per capita in its uprisings in 2011, and it also has the largest number of political prisoners per capita in the world. So we're talking surpassing North Korea. This is also a place that is home to America's Fifth Fleet. The Fifth Fleet is one of America's most important military installations in the world. Its jurisdiction includes over 25 countries that include Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, some of the biggest hotspots in the world in terms of American military operations. It's a refueling base, and it's a place where our war against ISIS is conducted. So this is why we went to report in Bahrain, because we wanted to show the implications of American foreign policy in the Middle East and the compromises that we make in terms of national security. On the one hand, many people argue this is a tiny island, and in terms of the numbers of people tortured, for example, maybe it's not as big as Syria in terms of the numbers. But I guess our argument is in a small country that has blanket policies of torture and human rights abuses that are in stark contradiction with U.S. values, can we not use our influence to improve those relations? And in fact, we have American laws that prohibit the export of arms and weapons to countries that violate human rights. So our investigation was looking at these human rights violations and America's role and complicity in these violations. When we were arrested, one of the things that I guess I would like to share that I think was most powerful for me, of course, our team had read all of these human rights reports. I had reported in the country in 2011 and knew many of the victims of these crimes. But had we not been arrested, I wouldn't be able to share this anecdote with you today. When we were arrested, we were being held in a police station at one point where you can actually see American service people outside. You're in a neighborhood where servicemen go out. So that juxtaposition of just how close our servicemen and women are to these torture chambers, a police station where they have abused civilians for over 5 years now. That was something that we couldn't have anticipated learning from our detention. But in February, my team entered Bahrain. For this report, we entered undercover without press credentials. We anticipated being deported in about 4 days. It takes very little time. It's a very small island, so they're going to find you at some point, especially if you're going around with cameras, and especially if you're meeting with opposition leaders and survivors of torture whose communications are monitored. Leading up to the trip, just to talk about the level of monitoring, we landed in a neighboring Gulf country that's an ally, and even in that country, we were not able to access Amnesty International and other websites that have human rights reports about the abuses in this area. So there's a huge clampdown on freedom of information and press in this region and a cover-up of many of these crimes. When we entered the country, just days before, we'd been communicating with our contacts on secure apps. The week that we entered, that app had been blocked entirely by the country, and we had to find a new way to communicate. So they really anticipated mass demonstrations against the government in the week that we were planning on coming, and we're preparing for that. We were able to be undercover for a couple of days, meeting with these protesters. Many of them are very young. We spoke with a young man who's a video journalist. He's an activist who uploads, stories from his own neighborhood of abuse and police coming into his neighborhood in the middle of the night, arresting people and families disappearing. And he is being hunted by the government. He has to change homes every 2 days. He's not able to communicate with his family because them even knowing exactly where he is puts them at risk. So these are the kinds of stories that we were covering and the people that we were meeting. On the day of our arrest, it was the 5-year anniversary of their uprising, and it was the scene of mass demonstrations. They tried to cordon off the opposition into neighborhoods, so just to imagine this scene, you can drive down the highway and it looks like this glistening Gulf oil kingdom, but then if you looked off the highway, you would see clouds of black smoke, and those were demonstrators clashing with the police in their neighborhoods. we got into one of those neighborhoods and planned on camping out. The scene was incredible and larger than life. It was much bigger than we could have imagined. We were protesters running around from the police all day, grandmothers pulling us into their homes, giving us water, but then wanting us to get back out there and tell the stories of their sons and grandsons being arrested for no reason. So this community ride resistance was fascinating and incredibly powerful, and we're happy we were able to document it. However, first, Tony, who's here with me today, was arrested while covering some of the demonstrators clashing with police. And then by that evening, we immediately called the embassy and started to activate our emergency plan. And they advised us to stay in the neighborhood because they are very aware of what's happening in this country. And they said the police have locked that neighborhood down. You're not getting out safely. So stay in the neighborhood. But by the end of the night, there was a protest where there was a march from a mosque to the police station that has been the site of torture and abduction of so many community members in this neighborhood. So you had men of all ages and women of all ages marching with pictures of their loved ones who'd been martyred, whether killed by torture or disappeared. So they were marching towards the police station when clashes erupted, and we were there to document that. However, the young people were so excited to have foreign journalists that they started tweeting our pictures, and that was eventually our downfall. So at that point, we decided we, of course, needed to leave the neighborhood, or we were scared that the police would come start arresting people while searching for us. So we went through field, coordinated an exit from this occupied neighborhood, got to the street, met our contact, a Bahraini journalist who picked us up. But when we were going down the highway, a new checkpoint had been put up since our colleague had arrived to pick us up, and we were detained from there. We were held in detention for about 48 hours. We were all separated and had very different experiences while in detention. And we were able to, after embassy assistance, and we do think that the embassy was extremely helpful, but also mobilized after there was a public outcry in support of our case on press freedom and human rights issues in Bahrain, run primarily by this organization, Frontline Freelance Register, and all of our allies in the journalist safety space, whether Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and all of these groups. Also, our clients that we've worked for over the years did come out, so we were all over CNN for 48 hours, and we appreciate that because that public outcry definitely mobilized the embassy to mobilize for our release, which wasn't difficult considering American influence on that island. The only other thing that I would note is we were very fortunate. We were relieved to be deported and released, but for some context, I have a colleague, Naziha Sayed. She's one of 4 Bahraini journalists who are independent journalists and able to receive press credentials. She was arrested, and when she was arrested, she was held at one of these police stations where she was beaten with a pipe, electrocuted, her head was shoved in a toilet, she was punched and kicked, called a spy, and eventually released. Her torturers walk free to this day. So that's what's at stake for our colleagues, and that's, I guess, the privilege of operating as an American in these contexts, but also, the guilt that comes with it when our colleagues are risking so much more to cover their own countries.
So I have just one more quick question, and then you are starting to populate the questions here, so I appreciate that. But I'm just curious who some of the worst offenders are, some of the worst media organizations that take advantage of freelance journalists and then not back them when trouble arises.
Well, I would love to name names, and we will probably be at that, I hope we won't be at that point as our negotiations continue. I guess I can speak to the major issues. So, for example, payment. This sounds so basic, and in any other contracted industry, we understand that journalism is not the only industry that's leading or trending towards contracted labor. It's a way to cut costs. It's also a way for employers to cut corners on health insurance and other benefits. But this is by no means something limited to journalism, but in conflict journalism, when they cut those corners, our lives are at stake in the field. So in terms of payment on time. Many journalists operate using their paychecks for the next assignment, and you're reimbursed after the fact. So if you're not paid on time, maybe you're cutting corners on your safety procedures for the next assignment. So things like that. It's just unprofessional and illegal, of course. Then the other issue is expenses. Some of these news organizations try not to provide expenses in advance to freelancers. And that's an enormous risk, and a risk that ultimately led to one of the most high-profile cases, our colleague Jim Foley. When he was reporting, he and other colleagues who were abducted in that time, I was working in that time under the exact same conditions as them in the exact same area, and I was fortunate not to be abducted. But I would say, that was just luck, because we were all working under the same conditions. When you don't have your expenses paid in advance, you make different decisions. In his case, it was taking a taxi instead of having a driver. In a war zone, you need a driver you can trust to deal with vigilante crimes and kind of mafias that arise in vacuums of power. He didn't have that, and that ultimately led, to the selling of him and other colleagues to groups like ISIS. So we are very strong on that point. And then the other problem is also the contracts that we sign, independent contracts in our industry. Force journalists, the industry standard forces indemnification clauses and freelancers to absorb essentially all of the risk. And so that's what I think is most stark to us. Those three issues, payment on time, payment of expenses in advance, and then these contracts, are what's most jarring when we're meeting with the industry, and they are talking the talk in terms of journalism safety, and never again for our colleagues when they're asking us to report under the same conditions that led to our colleagues' abduction. So that's how we feel about it without naming names, but yeah.
All right, so several students have asked this, as well as a man named Ty Tobin. They want to know specifically, have your gender and or your appearance created issues for you in the Middle East?
Unfortunately, I would say that I found that women are not safe anywhere in the world, whether it's here in the United States or elsewhere. I don't necessarily think the Middle East is more sexist or racist or intolerant than other parts of the world. I think it's lagging in terms of strong institutions and laws that protect marginalized groups. So I think that progressive movements in the United States that have fought for women's rights and rights for minorities are really important, because at least you have some framework to go off of. In many of these countries, you have no framework to go off of, and the police are corrupt, and your country's falling apart. So there's just no room for justice. So I'm operating in those contexts, and then so of course understand the risk of being a woman in that context, and the inability of my government to fully, intervene in those countries if something goes totally wrong on a gendered aspect, or if I were ever, I think it would be impossible to get justice for any kind of gender-based violence in any of these countries. But as a journalist and as a woman, there are times where it helps. I can access women's spaces more so than my male colleagues, but I would say, as much as women, I think journalists, we point to that advantage at sometimes, but we do face, I think what's more prevalent in my life is the risk of sexual assault, and that's part of my risk assessment in a way that none of my male colleagues are thinking about in theirs. So there are some perks. A mentor of mine told me early on, use your weaknesses and turn them into strengths. And my weaknesses when I started out were my youth and my gender. And I was able to turn those into strengths. I'm very passionate about women's issues, and I started covering issues of young women that I would have unique access to because of my identity, and that was not only something that was fulfilling to me and something I'm passionate about, but also professionally competitive, covering those issues and kind of carving out a niche and an expertise. So that's my advice, I guess, to women considering, working in these contexts. Turn your weaknesses into strengths and keep your head up, but of course the risks are still there.
Another journalist in the audience named Scott wants to know if your equipment and your material was returned to you, or if it's still in Bahrain.
The devastating part. Well, the best part of Bahrain, our sources are safe, and we got our material out, which was amazing. But our cameras and about like $20,000 worth of gear has been confiscated. We're still under investigation in Bahrain. We're hoping they're professional and return our gear as they say they will when they finish the investigation. We doubt that at this point. But yeah, that was devastating.
From Sam, another student in the room, how has the widespread use of social media technology by non-journalists to document and analyze the events on the ground changed the way journalists do their jobs?
I think overall it's exciting. Technology and the internet have devastated the financial model of our industry, but at the same time, I do think legacy media has played a very problematic role at different points in covering women's issues or marginalized groups historically. So I'm excited to see internet platforms and that allow people to tell their own stories. A lot of times in our space you hear journalists are the voice of the voiceless. Well, no one's voiceless. They just don't have access to tell their own stories sometimes. So that's why I think some of this online technology is really exciting, whether it's blogs or social media allowing people to document their own experiences on the ground in these places. And many times I think it can be even more powerful to see someone telling their own story from their perspective of their smartphone. In terms of reporting, it's gotten tricky. We have to verify this, and some of this stuff is very difficult to verify. The best example is Syria right now. It is incredibly dangerous. Most news agencies have pulled out since about 2012, so that means we've had years of very little coverage from the inside of Syria on the world's greatest humanitarian catastrophe and bloodiest war we've seen in decades. So again, that's why I think what's at stake when we don't support journalism in these contexts, just the darkness that can lead to impunity for war criminals. But we have seen some innovation around how we verify social media technology. So there are activists on the inside who are risking their lives, and we've come up with all sorts of ways for them to prove the date of something that they're filming, or prove the time, just some things, contextual evidence that allows us to actually be able to use their material and verify it in the way that we need to maintain our journalistic standards.
So reality show star and casino owner Donald Trump noted the other day how he would handle a situation regarding James Foley. A student in the audience wants to know, is the world more dangerous now for journalists since the execution of James Foley than it was before?
Maybe zooming out on that question a little bit, I think one trend that we're talking a lot about in our journalist safety groups is how technology has changed our relationship with designated terrorist organizations. Historically, journalists have met with the bloodiest of terrorist groups around the world, and while sometimes it has resulted in the same kind of fate of our colleague Jim Foley, many other times you have a relationship with a source inside one of these groups, and you're able to report safely because they also had some interest in getting their message out to the world, and you were sort of using each other, and of course I think many journalists feel it's important to have all sides of the stories, including terrorist organizations, particularly on issues of national security. What's changed, though, is with this new technology that we were talking about, these groups no longer need journalists to broadcast their own media to the world. And I think that's what we're talking about most from the past few years of how dispensable we are to these groups and how we're actually less valuable as communicators and more valuable as hostages. And if that's going to be if that's going to be the situation for us in the region, then the stakes again have never been higher.
So the
Sorry? No worries.
So the Frontline Freelance Registry or Register is more or less an attempt to negotiate better working conditions for freelance journalists. A person in the audience wants to know simply, why don't journalists unionize formally and strike?
Yeah. No, you're right. The issue is with online media, and what we've seen even in how we've evolved is many of us, as I mentioned, when we started as these young Arab Spring freelancers, we were working for unprofessional rates. And as someone getting into the industry, you need that first byline. And we understand why a young person who is trying to get into the industry is working for very little pay. So as much as we'd like to go on strike, we realize with this new technology and the ability to self-publish and everything, we just can't control that. Like, the news agencies won't just switch to publishing some student for free or something. So we just think tactically it's not as effective as unions could have been historically, given the climate that we're working in. And that's why we are trying to, right now, work with the industry and point to, the standards that they have had for, the past century on war reporting for their staffers, and, ask how they are going to start applying those to freelancers when the trend has been towards taking freelance work instead of opening a bureau in most parts of the world.
So there's some questions regarding popular media and your life and how it is reflected in, say, the movie Whiskey Tango Foxtrot or the television show Homeland.
Yeah, haven't seen Whiskey Tango Foxtrot yet, but I want to see it. What I've heard about it is that there's an aspect of adventure to this, and that's certainly true. And it would be a lie to say that there's not an adrenaline rush of doing what you're doing. But I think that's what we're talking about in terms of professionalism. Always there's going to be the adrenaline junkie or fame seeker or war tourist in these contexts. The vast majority of journalists are professional, deeply principled people who are risking their lives because they believe that these injustices are unthinkable and need to be shared. And while even in the Vietnam War, when we had some great war reporting, that didn't stop the war, but at least documented for our collective memory what war looks like. And to this day, it's always said we don't want another Vietnam, and it's because I think we all think of those images, and it is very powerful historically. In terms of seeing media make a difference, I have seen it. When I first started working in Egypt during the revolution, Al Jazeera bravely just kept their cameras rolling over the square, and they caught insane abuses by the government, and that ultimately shamed the government and mobilized the world and the Egyptian government's partners in the United States that guaranteed their dictatorship to back off. So we've also seen in Libya, when I entered Libya, there were banners and caricatures of journalists who'd risked their life and died reporting already in Libya at that point, and it was because people needed their stories told, and it ultimately resulted in action. The worst example is Syria, that we do not have a lot of coverage coming out of Syria, and while I think it's also very much distorted how we understand ISIS and the climate between Syria and Iraq right now. The majority of war crimes against Syrians, the vast majority, have been conducted by the dictator Assad. He's the president of Syria. So the fact that we think of ISIS as the greatest perpetrator of war crimes in the Syrian theater, that totally misrepresents the situation. And ISIS has been, incredibly savvy in how they broadcast their horror, but they're not statesmen. They don't want to be. So, they don't have the same, protocols as the government of Assad, who tortures silently. He has one of the most effective and wide-ranging torture apparatuses in the world, and he, still gives interviews to the BBC and acts like a statesman and denies all of these things. He certainly doesn't want cameras in those torture chambers. So we want more journalists inside Syria, and we want organizations to support us to work there as safely as possible.
So in the same line of questioning, someone in the audience wants to know if U.S. media involvement in Bahrain has worsened or improved the relationship between the government and its people.
There has been a process since 2011. The government, when the protesters came out and demanded their rights. It's actually, it's such a crazy situation because it's probably the most moderate Arab Spring movement. They're not even asking for a revolution. They've been asking for a constitutional monarchy. They just want to kind of vote. It's not even a radical demand. And so that, I think, is another reason why it's insane that the U.S. hasn't, it's insane that there isn't aid given to, that there aren't, how would I say this? That our aid isn't conditional upon adherence to human rights. At different points, there's been huge clampdowns. The response, there has been some media coverage, and at different points, human rights defenders and journalists worked together and did get the U.S. to halt arms transfers to Bahrain for a short period of time. What happened then was the Bahraini government came to the negotiation table with protesters. They laid out a path to reform and human rights, and that, that's really progress. That's exciting. That's something that didn't happen. The opposition was excited, if not skeptical, of the government. And then, because they just laid that out, the government decided to start transferring weapons again. And the issue there is it's not enough to just make a framework for reform. They've only implemented 2 of the 26 reforms that they promised to the United States and international community. So our arms transfers are, I think, one of the biggest challenges to our relations with countries in the Middle East.
So there are several prospective journalists here in the room, and they're majoring in journalism, and I know you didn't at the University of Wisconsin. They want to know how they might set about that path of doing what you're doing.
Well, it's always amazing being on a college campus because there are so many resources at your disposal, whether it's grants to travel, learn a language, speakers that come to campus so you can network, your professors who are teaching you to craft and the history of this legacy and this career, which is just really exciting. So just taking advantage of all of those tools at your disposal and opportunities. The other thing I guess I would say is maybe start thinking of yourselves not only as journalists who need to not only perfect a craft and also serve the public, but also as entrepreneurs. The industry is falling apart. A lot of the jobs coming out aren't the journalistic jobs you dreamed of. Not many people in this country can afford to move to New York City and take an unpaid internship and then take a starting salary that will never cover your rent in these cities. So, again, take advantage of opportunities when you're a journalist, but realizing it's a very tough business climate. And the saddest thing I think I've seen is journalists who I respect tremendously who have moved on to other professions, not because they weren't good enough at the craft and didn't have the passion for this job, but because the industry is pushing so many great people out.
And one final question. Several people wanted to thank you for sharing your incredible personal story with us. And they also want to know what's next and how do we read or watch what you're doing?
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for coming and for your interest in these issues. The public is our greatest ally in our struggle to maintain quality journalism, and it's why we're doing this and why we're risking our lives, so we appreciate any interest in these issues. In terms of what's next, we were filming throughout the Arab world, in Gaza, Bahrain, and Egypt, and we have plans to film in 3 other countries, a documentary series on how U.S. Foreign policy affects young people in the Middle East. For me, it's a dream project. It's the story of what I've been doing the past 5 years, has been growing up with these protesters who, were faced with challenges we can't imagine in the U.S. in terms of what the stakes were for standing up for their rights. So watching those brave young people fight for the future of their country and really be betrayed, not only by their own governments, but oftentimes by ours. These are a population that will never be able to vote in our elections, yet our decisions affect their lives in a way we can't comprehend. So it's a documentary series about what's at stake and how our country affects others.
And do you have distribution?
We are in negotiations on that, so hopefully we'll have updates on that soon.
All right, cool. Well, we do need to vacate the room. I appreciate your patience and your contributions. Anna Day.